Hello and welcome to Taking the Stand. And if today's recording looks a bit, different than usual, there are some reasons for it. It's not only, the bearded, handsome man that is now appearing with me on this podcast, Mr. Caiden Lang, whom I will introduce shortly. It is also that we have to use Teams today because StreamYard, our usual platform, it's been a long year, and I think StreamYard is feeling that as well. So it's giving us a few headaches, but I think we will, soldier on. In today's episode of Taking the Stand, we are going to look at a further aspect. We're going to continue the series of capital S social, capital J justice versus and usual, just, straight up justice, how these two intersect, where they come from, and continuing this discussion where things like critical race theory, as we see now, even with this incident of the Proteas and Quentin de Kock and all the drama around that, how it's really influencing South African thinking, South African, not just politics, but much, much broader than that. If we can, think that something has influenced how we view a cricket player or a rugby player, then, it's really, permeated and soaked deep into South African culture. So I'm joined by Caiden Lang, who is affiliated with the Institute of Race Relations and is specifically the EDONTI project, Educate, Don't Indoctrinate. He works with Sarah quite a lot, but today I thought Caiden would be the perfect chap to speak to, because we're going to look at something that might reveal a bit of an hypocrisy in critical race theory, and that is the grandfathers, the intellectual grandfathers, as it were, of critical race theory as it is today permeating, the world, but South Africa specifically. Right. So CRT, Caiden, is critical race theory is probably the most prominent part of the broader critical theory, social justice movement, specifically in South Africa. And that's sort of to be expected with our history of racial division, racial oppression. It makes sense that a theory with a racial element would find, fertile ground here. Now, we've spoken about CRT before on Taking the Stand, but perhaps a recap would be good. What would you say are the core tenets of CRT?
Sure, Hermann. So, well, first of all, critical race theory is an approach to trying to deal with racial discrimination and like how it manifests itself in the world. So in that sense, it's got very noble aims. Classical liberals like us also trying to do the same thing, but we go about it in a very different way. So the first thing to understand about critical race theory is that everything is about power dynamics. And so if you have a look at the history of the world and the history of social interaction, it is, you get groups that are powerful and groups that are not. But what's very important is the sites of power can be found in identity groups. And so when we're talking about critical race theory, we're specifically talking about racial identity groups. And so that's the first thing to understand, is that every interaction between different races has some element of power dynamics going on. And then we kind of sort into a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is white supremacy at the top, and then all other colors and everybody else that's kind of seemed to be oppressed by white supremacy is underneath that. And so, well, what you kind of get out of that, I guess, is just the thought that racism is everywhere. And even when we think it's not, the reason for that is because we have either internalized our oppression or internalized our dominance. And why power is so important and why it factors so much into this entire thing is because the powerful groups, and like it makes a lot of sense, get to basically make the rules. And I mean, rules that go as deep as how we view the world, how we make sense of the world, how we organize the world, all sorts of things like that, how we use language, and what is truth. I mean, all of these have got to do with power. And so the powerful groups get to determine all of that. And in this case, the powerful group would be white people or Europeans. And so the thought is that every single thing that Europeans have done in the way that we see the world has been designed specifically to maintain that dominance of white people. If this sounds very reductionist, that's because it is. But yeah, so I would say that those are the two main things, is that power dynamics shape all of our social interactions, and that because of that, racism is everywhere, even if we don't know it, because we've been socialized into believing in white supremacy and the white ways of knowing that come along with it.
Sure. As summary answers go, I don't think I've heard it put that succinctly, and I think that makes, it makes sense of why these people behave the way they behave. Is once you sort of understand where these proponents are coming from, it becomes less crazy, even if it doesn't become less sinister to things like non-racialism. And this white supremacy idea, this viewing the world through the idea that it's all structured in white school of thought, it does give CRT quite an anti-white flavor that seems, to me at least, to be in stark contrast to the non-racialism that the South African Constitution envisions.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, but so if you're talking to a CRT scholar and you ask them, is it anti-white or is it anti-white people? They will often make a distinction, but then we'll kind of explain why the line gets very blurred. So I wouldn't say that CRT is necessarily anti-white people. So like, it's not anti-Caiden. However, it is anti-whiteness. And so it's anti all of those properties associated with being white. And so here what happens, and here's the little trick, is that because I'm white, I carry the property of whiteness. And so I guess the only way that I can kind of get rid of that whiteness in me is to dismantle it or reject all the cultures, norms, and values that have been socialized into me. And so, like you say, it is anti-white, but it's more anti-whiteness. But then that feeds into, okay, all white people are actually part of the problem, and so we all kind of need to do the work. And so it starts to look very similar to being anti-white people.
Yeah, no, I mean, it quacks like a duck and it swims like a duck. It's starting to look awfully much like a duck, and or barking dogs in this case. I do apologize. I don't know if you could hear the barking dogs on my end, but they are, I think what you said probably upset them, but it is upsetting a bit, and it is barking. In their book Cynical Theories, James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, on this ground, sort of actually argues that you can trace the origins of critical race theory as we see it today back to white European continental male philosophers like Foucault and Derrida. Now, do you think there's some merit in that argument, that you can see critical race theory and look back through the genealogy and find Granddaddy Foucault and Granddaddy Derrida are somewhere there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so especially what we were kind of talking about earlier with the element of critical race theory that has to do with power. And so Foucault and Derrida were part of a school of thought called postmodernism, which, I mean, it incorporated a whole bunch of stuff, and it's quite hard to actually define, but it kind of arose like in between the 1950 and 1970, particularly the 1960s. And I can kind of understand why it arose. I mean, Western civilization seemed to be eroding. I mean, we had world wars. We saw the rise of communism and the failures of communism, and these thinkers were trying to understand all of that, and so they were very, very skeptical of Western civilization, and then what came along with that, like Enlightenment rationalism, so the scientific method, logic, neutral principles of constitutional law, all of those kind of things. And so they were trying to almost deconstruct what went wrong, and I mean, they were disillusioned with the rise of fascism, and are trying to work all of that out. And so basically they were trying to understand power hierarchies, and in particular what they called meta-narratives. And so a meta-narrative would be like a grand story that we all tell ourselves, and we are all kind of part of a meta-narrative. And so meta-narratives could be religions or Western schools of thought and things like that. And they thought that meta-narratives were bad because they, well, in particular, the meta-narrative associated with Western civilization, because that's what led to the rise of fascism, world wars, and things like that. And so they basically tried to deconstruct that whole process in terms of power dynamics, and especially, and Jacques Derrida in particular was very interested in language and how we use language and how that shapes the way that we think, and how whoever's in charge of the meta-narrative, and so in terms of race would be white men, how we use language to actually oppress other people. And so what they tried to do is to point this out. And so there was radical skepticism in terms of what we actually know as true, and that's shaped by language. And Foucault came up with a concept called power knowledge, where those two are kind of intimately tied together. And basically it's a very cynical thing. So what you are meant to try and do is develop a critical consciousness to be able to notice when these power hierarchies are in play, notice how they relate to language, and then problematize everything. And yeah, that's basically it. I mean, I don't think that was a very good explanation, and like it goes a lot wider than that, and like a lot of it actually goes back to Marx, which is like a really interesting thing, but maybe we can kind of get onto that a little bit later.
Yes, and I think what's so interesting is the postmodern principle of power knowledge and problematization is what we're seeing today with critical race theory. So there's definitely this ancestral connection that today's critical race theorists, whether they like it or not, and it's not necessarily something to be ashamed of, but it is something that sort of starts undermining the critical race theory argument, because with this rather pronounced anti-white bias, perhaps even anti-European bias, perhaps even anti-male bias that critical theories generally, or critical theory generally, and critical race theory specifically relies on or breathes as its oxygen, isn't there a bit of a hypocrisy? And you mentioned Marx as well. Isn't there a bit of a hypocrisy that these visionaries and prophets of CRT today are building their temples on the ruins or even the foundations of, let's face it, old white European men.
Yeah, nice try. I think a way to get around that is to say that these white men had almost thrown off the shackles of their whiteness because they saw through it. And so maybe they weren't, I don't know, in a way authentically white, because they developed a critical consciousness, which means they were like probably some of the first allies. And so yeah, like I do get that argument. However, I do think that there is a way around that, just to say, yes, okay, but these guys weren't buying into whiteness, and they were trying to dismantle it and to try to problematize it within themselves and their society. And so they're all right. But like, I guess it is a pick and choose kind of thing. But an interesting thing too is I have heard reports, and Lindsay and Pluckrose speak about this, is nowadays it's quite often the case that an article you write won't be accepted by a journal if you cite too many of these, as you say, old European men. And so what you kind of got to do is, if you want to reference Foucault, for instance, instead of referencing him directly, you reference a black scholar that referenced him, so that you are kind of more relying on the black scholars rather. So the fact that that is happening means that there's certainly merit to your argument, but then at the same time, you can maybe get around it by saying, no, these guys were allies and they had developed a critical consciousness, and that means that they are on our side, basically.
So how would you handle a scenario like that? For example, I'm a law student, or I'm a philosophy student, and at some prestigious university, possibly in a coastal city with a famous flat mountain. Let's say in this hypothetical scenario, a lecturer or a fellow student or a tutor makes this point that CRT requires the full emancipation of Black people from the dominance of white systems designed by Granddaddy Foucault and Granddaddy Marx, or great-granddaddy Marx perhaps. Would it then be a useful defense and an opportunity to actually promote non-racialism, to mention that, you're just the intellectual grandchildren of these white guys, and if you want to throw off the shackles, I mean, is it shackles all the way down? How would you handle a situation like that?
Very carefully in this day and age, I think. Yeah, I don't know if it would be that useful to actually approach it in that way, because I think that you could kind of make the argument that I was making earlier. I would perhaps pick up on other things that you said there, and that the lecturer said, to like kind of pick apart the arguments. Like I would perhaps want to ask my lecturer, could he please explain exactly what emancipating yourself from white culture would mean? Because that's a thing. I've noticed that whenever that kind of thing comes up, it's so often left in the abstract, and so like it's just white culture, and so and I think that there's a reason for that, and I think that lecturers and scholars are quite hesitant to actually say what they really mean, because then I think a lot of ears will start to prick up. So I would kind of get a little bit of clarity on exactly what that means, because I mean, a lot of us know that what that actually means is, okay, well, let's dispense with logic and stuff like that. And so if that came up, I would then perhaps say to my lecturer, okay, but you are using logic in the course of your argument. And so I would maybe go that route where you just pick holes in it. Although just going back to the argument that you make about the old European men, yeah, there is validity to that. And like it is worthwhile pursuing that line of thought. But I think it can, the lecturer will circumnavigate that in some quite smart ways, especially if he is a CRT activist himself.
Yeah, because it almost commits the fallacy of ad grand hominem. You're not attacking this person; you're attacking the hominem a few generations ago. But I love what you're saying about, and we've seen it so many times that the good offense is in a verbal or in a debate or in an exchange of ideas is often just probing questions, expose people in their basic assumptions, and you will get far. And you can call it the Socratic method, but don't call it in that situation, because they will just dismiss it as another old white men product. But Caiden, thank you so much for today.
Sure.
I just found it fascinating, and it's scarce these days to get a discussion like this where it's not agenda pushing, where it is let's handle this thing, let's take it on in a responsible way, not in some shrill way, but let's look at where it comes from and see what knowledge can persuade, what knowledge can encourage, and what knowledge can actually reach out to other people. Because at the end of the day, that's probably that's what freedom is about. No man is an island, and the freedom to think for yourself, and the freedom to not be responsible for whiteness or blackness or whatever the color of your skin is something worth fighting for. And as we say here at FAN, and with this I sign off, your freedom is worth fighting for. Caiden, thank you very much. Everyone at home,